Hi guys, welcome to Starter Wealth, where we give practical and actionable advice to starting your wealth and creating and maintaining your business. This video is a continuation of the last video, the basics on how to manage your company through a crisis. With today's discussion, we will outline a 6-step plan to put into action the foundational principles we presented in part 1 of this series. If you missed that video, I'll link to it here and also in the description below. Before we dive in, I'll just do a quick review of what we learned in the basics, starting with the main concepts. Instead of the shareholder capitalism of the 70s, we need to focus on stakeholder capitalism. Now, more than ever, this is a global and interconnected world. You can't just focus on one aspect of your business to the exclusion of all other important factors. Today's world is like the ecological system. Back then, we maybe didn't understand the butterfly effect of nature and what can happen if you change one thread to one extreme or another. Now we understand that nature is completely connected. That is how we have to view business and the world we operate in. A healthy, robust economy can't be an isolationist one. It limits your options. When we think about the end goal of our business, we have to think beyond our shareholders' net gain. We have to think about the whole picture. In thinking about the whole picture, you have to be on the lookout for problems that masquerade as black swans and recognize that improbable does not mean impossible. Think of it a little like going into battle. You have to imagine every possible scenario when there's that much at stake. If you underestimate the situation, no matter how improbable, that's an advantage to your competition. And if you're truly caught on your heels, that could be a fatal blow to your business if you can't get it right. That brings us to the third main concept covered in the basics, and that is that we have to get our mind in the right headspace and think like our survival depends on it. Because for many of us, it does. As discussed in the basics video, this mind frame is usually associated with the immigrant business mentality. Faced with extreme challenges, they have no choice but to survive. To be able to facilitate survival, your business has to be both agile and resilient. The eventual outcome of being both agile and resilient is that you will be able to manage and identify risk. To that end, the 6 steps we are going to discuss and implement today all beef up your agility and resilience. Oh, on the subject of resilience, I'm thinking about doing a deep dive into resilience as there's been a lot of research and interesting case studies into it from a social science level perspective. Comment down below and let me know if that's something you'd like to see as well. Okay, let's get into it. Step number 1 is the speed of your reaction. Simply put, you have to be able to move with speed and agility. Face the problem head. What does that mean practically? Well, some suggestions to speed up your reaction time are to create smaller decision-making groups. Decision-making processes that are convoluted or unclear only serve to slow it down when you can't afford the delay. You need to cut the bureaucratic tape. Decisions should never be made in a silo, but they're hardly able to be made by consensus among the populace either. So it's important to identify who the decision makers should be and who they should consult and inform along the way. This is again part of the Dacey and Racy models of workflow processes. I'll definitely make a video on both those topics soon. Comment down below if you want to see it sooner. You need to identify more limited priorities. Smart businesses always have a list of goals and objectives they're trying to accomplish, and there's a time and place for that. When you're operating in this fast-paced environment, however, you need to be efficient and strategic with your resources. Pare it down to just a few ultra-important priorities. You have to be able to pivot to fit the new normal. When this all happened, no one had any idea how long this would last. As people started realizing we could be in it for the long haul, restaurants had to pivot to takeout and family meals. Wholesale food providers shifted to sell direct to consumers. Salons sold home coloring kits, and spas and personal care services sold prepaid gift cards. Like evolution, we all had to adapt to survive. Your marketing needs to keep pace with the change in your offerings. Pivoting doesn't just mean with regard to what you sell, but also how you market it. Content promoting scenes with big group celebrations would be out of touch with what's happening today. And simultaneously, with all the social awareness happening, could you imagine Kendall Jenner's Pepsi commercial now? I mean, it was a rough reception back then. Could you even imagine it today? To speed up your reaction time, you can also restructure current teams to support new areas of increasing need. For example, restaurant managers became takeout packers to accommodate the increase in takeout orders, and the fact that there isn't usually a role dedicated solely to expediting and packing orders for takeout. Waiters and waitresses became delivery drivers to accommodate never-before-provided delivery for those high-end restaurants who had to pivot to carry-out and delivery service from tablecloth dining. In a hiring standstill, you might not need an HR and recruiting department. Those people are usually administratively adept, and you can shift them to organizational and clerical roles. The goal is to be able to keep your people, but shift them to new seats on the bus if you have to. Step number 2, read the room. What that means is being able to identify the situation you're personally in. Do you have an excess of inventory that you can still sell while shutting down current production so that you don't overshoot the buying preferences of people heading into a recession? Can you pick up production quickly should the need arise? And again, can you pivot instead of shutting down? Ultimately, you need to be able to determine the demand relative to your available working capital and vis-a-vis your employees and the people who depend on you. The easy thing to do would be to shut down if you have low or no overhead and furlough your workers to reserve working capital for when demand picks back up. But in doing so, you risk losing those workers to other employers. And when demand does pick back up, where does that leave you? Do you then lose out because you need to retrain new hires? Or even worse, what if you can't find anyone readily available and qualified to even train? On the flip side, I came across one particularly interesting quote. The CEO was asked by his employees why his company decided to shut down its global R&D center, which symbolized the future of the business. And he replied, "If we cannot survive the next 3 months, we will have no future at all." It's very much a balance between what you have to do, what you want to do, and what you think you may have to do. Avoid being purely reactive and use as much information as you have available to you to try to really assess your current situation. Step number 3, evaluate your finances. Know how much you have and how much you'll need in the most likely scenario and also in the worst case scenario. Most people only plan for the most likely option, but COVID-19 was the worst case, least likely thing to happen in the eyes of most of the populace. But it's happening. Get really, really good at thinking about what could happen just as much as what is most likely to happen. Get a little paranoid. You can't protect your flank if you don't see it coming. Okay, next, make sure you take advantage of all the financial resources available. We've discussed this a lot on this channel already, so I'll link to the videos on the PPP and EIDL here as well as in the description below. But whether or not you think you're going to need it, remember to plan for the worst case scenario. If you're covered even in a worst case scenario, then maybe you don't need the EIDL. But if there's even a doubt about your financial security in the near future due to COVID, you should take the loan before the deadlines run out, which, as a reminder, are August 8th, 2020 for the PPP loan and December 31st, 2020 for the EIDL. Beyond that, those with good credit and long business histories usually have access to credit, whether via a revolving line of credit or credit cards. Obviously, credit cards are the worst option on a normal basis due to their high interest rates, but there are usually 0% balance transfer and 0% purchase offers available often. And probably the most important concept you need to understand: cut things before you cut people. You can renegotiate your rent. A lot of cities have temporary rent measures to help struggling businesses. And honestly, if you've been a good tenant, your landlord probably understands and is open to some rent renegotiation, even when there aren't laws mandating rent deferments. At this point in time, it would be difficult for a landlord to find a new tenant when most offices are running remote anyways through the pandemic. The rule of economics should apply here, where $1 is better than 0. Another big ticket item that you can lower is your current interest rate payments by refinancing your debt. There are debt consolidators out there who can potentially package your debt together to have an aggregate lower interest rate. And finally, while I wouldn't cut employee benefits like healthcare and retirement funds, if at all possible, I would cut incidental benefits like working meals and other incidental employee perks, if you offer them. I want to emphasize, though, that anything related to employee morale and employee welfare should be the last resort on your cutting list. Step number 4, protect the well-being of your workers, including yourself. Practically speaking, that means avoid layoffs, like we discussed. They should always be the last option. And practice self-care across the board. When we talk about the human capital aspect of running a business, it's important to note that the steps you take pre-crisis are not the same as post-crisis. However, in regard to this particular step, we do need to discuss the pre-crisis aspects to this so that if you're not already doing these things now, at least you'll be aware and ready to implement them once you get over the current emergency. The pre-crisis steps set you up so that when you are in the middle of a real emergency, you have more options than to just lay people off and cut your human assets. Before a crisis hits, you should invest in employee training, pay your employees well, and provide generous benefits. Some of you are thinking, well, obviously, if I had the money, that's what I would want to do. But the point is to make it one of your business priorities so that when you do have the available capital, you put it to employee resources first rather than shareholder profits or other business concerns. Doing these things adheres to the social contract between employer and employee and creates social capital. Social capital is what you need to be able to rely on during a crisis of this magnitude. Treating your employees in a way that says you value them and prioritizing their concerns shows that you appreciate what they do and that what they do matters. Companies with high social capital can retain employees even when they have to cut benefits or employee pay in order to survive. They're able to do this because the employee knows that they are a priority to the company, and if the company needs to do this, they trust that it is a last resort. The three drivers of social capital are fairness, equality, and trust. Procedural fairness makes a difference. How are problems and processes arbitrated? Fairness encourages trust and loyalty, both of which are the backbone needed for a healthy, productive, and innovative company. You might be thinking, are there any company men or company women anymore these days? Well, since the 1960s, loyal employee-employer relationships have been on the decline. Most say it's a direct correlation to the switch in priority from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism in the 70s. Doing so violated the social contract, and thus social capital correspondingly decreased as well. The thing is, loyalty is reciprocal, and while intangible, it has a tangible value. James Harder, chief scientist, workplace management and well-being for Gallup, says that perhaps the most compelling argument for trying to retain good workers is that replacing managerial and professional employees can cost approximately 150% of their annual salary, according to various estimates. Harder suggests that for frontline, lower-end workers, it costs about half of their salaries, while for high-level IT professionals, the figure could be as high as 200%. The real impact, he says, can be on coworkers' productivity. In the book Originals, How Nonconformists Move the World by Adam Grant, which I'll link to below as it's a super interesting, largely anecdotal read, but he's been a professor at Wharton and received his BA from Harvard, and I'm sure has a host of other accolades and academic degrees. But he writes, skills and stars are fleeting. Commitment lasts. When founders had a commitment blueprint, the failure rate was 0. The reason for that remarkable result was that the founders of such companies focused on finding people with a cultural fit over skills and potential. They also worked to build strong emotional bonds rather than giving autonomy and challenging tasks. It was a recipe for long-term success. Put in a way that most basic humans can understand, looks fade and are the least valuable thing in your partner, right? Or rather, they should be. Diving further into my research on the topic of the social contract and dissolution of loyalty, as discussed by The End of Loyalty by Rick Wartzman, also linked below, he notes that as a leader, you have to be ready to take the first hit. If you don't sacrifice, you can't ask your employees to sacrifice. If you expect people to behave safely or with ethics, you have to behave the same way. And if you're asking employees to work 24/7, you need to be in the trenches with them, first in and last out. Some of you may be thinking, it's my company and I can do what I want. Sure, you can, but the pitfalls of running an autocracy are that everything is on you and you rule alone, with no ability to leverage valuable resources without a reciprocating tangible incentive, like money, which you're probably short on during a crisis like this. Let's be clear, though, that sacrifice for the sake of it is not worthwhile in the long run. People will eventually wonder why they should sacrifice based on the magnitude of what you're asking of them. Whereas if you tie the sacrifice to the vision, mission, and values of your organization, people will understand the context and carry it forward. Practically speaking, the quality of the relationship between an employee and his or her manager determines the overall level of employee engagement. The need to be connected remains constant, and that drives human behavior. Good middle managers make a huge difference, as well as offering mentoring opportunities in your company. Feeling connected creates a social cost to the employee if they choose to leave. Okay, now that we've established the importance of prioritizing and adhering to the pre-crisis care for your employees and yourself, let's move on to the post-crisis steps. The first one is that you should identify the pain points and find empathy for the shared experience we're all going through. Give flexibility to your workers juggling home life and work, managing childcare in an unideal home work setup. You too may be dealing with your own kids, pets, aging parents at home. Create employee engagement by making clear we're all in this together. Formalize and enable remote work. A remote work policy answers the following questions. When do you expect your team to be available? How will they be available? Slack, email, video? What deliverables are they responsible for? Without a remote work option, you open your company up to potential liability, workforce low morale, and sick leave requests, which means it doesn't matter whether you allow remote work or not. The result is still the same, employees who don't show up. Be aware that self-motivated and outcome-focused individuals are more able to make the transition seamlessly, but employees who are more used to a traditional command and control mode need more training to be effective. And not just frontline employees, but managers must also be taught to trust their employees to work remotely. The way to do that is to move to a results-driven approach and not a presence-driven model. That's a good segue into our next point, which is to rethink how you incentivize and evaluate employee performance. We used to use tools like Hiver to measure how quickly clients' concerns were addressed. During this slow time, we shifted priorities to employee training and whether or not they were doing the work to teach support staff and cross-train departments. During a crisis, it's understandable that you may have to cut pay and other benefits. So how do you keep your workforce motivated and on board? Well, hopefully you did the groundwork and have a well of social capital to draw from. But even then, the longer a crisis goes on, the more that bucket drains. So how do we keep our workers incentivized? Cutting costs is just one way to net a profit. There are 3 obvious ways to net profit: increase revenue, cut costs, or both. I've always preferred to try to make more money rather than cut my costs. It's that lifestyle creep, you know? If you want the uncapped potential to make money, you shouldn't unreasonably limit the resources you throw at it. There's the old saying, to make money, you have to spend money. There are creative ways to do so, even in a pandemic that shuts down entire industries. For example, you can offer things like deferred compensation, stock options, and shares in the profit or revenue. I do want to caution, though, that in general, workers are more incentivized if they feel they have control of attaining the incentive. So, top executives could have their compensation tied to net profit because they largely control the drivers of net profit. However, low-level employees need to be incentivized at the base level, like with per-piece productivity bonuses, per-sale commission, etc. I remember an old episode of Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares where Gordon offered $100 as bonus to the server who sold the most plates of the night's special dish. It was a quick, short-term bonus with immediate ROI. It achieved a dual purpose as the night's special served to use up expiring ingredients so that they would have less waste in the kitchen, and it increased their sales for the night. They effectively cut food costs and increased revenue at the same time, while rewarding their employees for playing an important part in doing so. But even beyond financial incentives, there are the intangible incentives that motivate some employees, like increasing their sense of value to the organization by giving them more meaningful work, promoting them within the organization with a title bump, offering an alternative work week where they only work Monday through Thursday and get Friday to Sunday off. There are many ways to skin a cat. The key is that each person is different, and a good leader knows what it is that will motivate a particular individual. Another crucial post-crisis step is to practice self-care across the board. A sick workforce leads to more retraining and hiring costs. Sick means unmotivated, not committed, as well as just physically sick. Logically, a worker that feels more concerned and committed to the company would bring more value to the company. In this graph of the effects of an unhealthy workplace from the article, The Business Case for a Healthy Workplace, you can see all the ways in which an unhealthy organization can lead to the factors that decrease productivity and ultimately lead to increased costs. In a study published in 2000 by Applebaum et al., his theory of performance states that performance is a function of employee ability, motivation, and opportunity. Everything is linked, and everything will eventually affect your bottom line. Leading through a crisis means managing yourself as well and practicing self-care on yourself too. At the most basic level, that means exercise, a balanced diet, and meditation is also often promoted. And finally, the last practical action is to avoid layoffs during a crisis, if at all possible. Your workforce is already anxious about everything in this situation. If they also have to worry about the security of their job, you can kiss goodbye to whatever motivation they had to keep being productive at work. And of course, as aforementioned, layoffs will invariably violate the social contract if it's for any other reason except as a last resort. Whew. On to step number 5. I know step number 4 was a long one, but that should really underscore how important your human capital is to your organization. Okay, step number 5. Be transparent. In an article from the Harvard Business Review, where they interviewed more than 350 senior executives at Chinese firms, they discovered that the companies that successfully navigated the pandemic through China's lockdown regularly kept their teams up to date on the state of things, as well as the priorities and principles that would guide decisions at all levels. They discovered by doing so, employees adopted a feeling of we're all in this battle together and fighting the same enemy, which seemed to exceed any localized employee dissatisfaction. Let's face it, not everyone is going to be 100% happy with the choices you have to make all the time. And as with any entrenched community, a small but vocal minority can have an outsized effect on the majority over time. Being transparent and stamping out rumors and innuendo right away establishes that you can be trusted, even when they may not agree with your position. Be aware, though, that if you're willing to say it, and you should be, you have to be willing to live it. Basically, business owners have to walk the walk and talk the talk. Employees are watching to see if you're in line with your stated corporate values or not. Again, it's that social contract all over again. If you want them to do as you say, you must also do as they do. Step number 6, be able to manage and foresee the future of your business. You need to be able to anticipate all the possibilities, even and especially the improbable ones. Because as we've been learning with COVID-19, improbable does not mean impossible. You can't cope with an emergency if you haven't anticipated the possibility that an emergency will come along. Over-prepare and be willing to be criticized for over-preparing. As a risk-averse business owner, this is the tenet I live by. My team and I worked exhaustively at the beginning of this year, and, well, frankly, every year. It's my paranoia that the well will dry up and that we'll need to be able to outlast the dry season. It's the grasshopper versus the ant, and I am the ant. I don't want to have to worry about what if winter comes. I knew that while I might not know when, I do know.
Winter is coming.
But because we worked so tirelessly in the first quarter of the year, we had enough to set us up so that we didn't have to be anxious or stress about our staff or our own funds. Another practical option is to purchase business interruption insurance. While it may not cover COVID-19 anymore as a known quantity, it may cover future unexpected emergencies. Set the proper strategies for long-term success during the good times, so that in the bad times you'll have options. Short-term success, like squeezing employees to increase net profits, means that during the bad times your options are limited. Like we discussed, if you treat your employees right when you can, then if it comes to a time where you need some flexibility from them, they'll give it to you as well. There are many incentives during the good times for you as a business owner to forget to make the best decisions. When money is flowing, it's easy to forget the people who helped you get there. But as a leader, you need to constantly and vigorously protect against short-term performance pressures. If you have a strong balance sheet, now is the time to lay all your chips out on the table. Your competitors might be struggling, and you are in a unique environment where those with the most resources have the clear advantage. In that same study of Chinese firms we referenced earlier, the ones who successfully navigated the crisis, they discovered that the market-leading firms who had strong reserves actively invested in the short term with the sole focus of extending their long-term advantage over less endowed competitors. The leaders of these firms responded to tough times not by preserving resources, but by investing their reserves in strengthening their firm's competitive position in the market. Ultimately, the best companies have already prepared financial buffers. They have built a workforce that can cope with a crisis, all of which leads to agility and resilience. And most of these firms don't need to lay off anybody. The reason they were able to do all this goes back to how you lead. If you treat your employees like trusted partners instead of hired hands, you'll foster a more participative environment where people share information and innovate collaboratively to not only survive, but thrive and adapt. The companies who are short-sighted and think they built an empire on their own shoulders are the ones who, in a crisis, find out it was all just an illusion. Look, you don't have to believe me that treating your employees well will make you more money, but let me leave you with one final statistic. The core expectation that consumers have of brands in any situation, but particularly in a crisis, is that brands will do what is right for their employees, suppliers, customers, and society at large without regard for how much it costs, with 90% of customers stating that brands should be willing to suffer substantial financial losses to ensure the well-being and financial security of others. Brands that do not do this run the risk of alienating a wide swatch of consumers. 71% of those surveyed promised that brands and companies that place their profits before people during the crisis would lose. In conclusion and summary, guys, it's not too late to implement any and all of these steps. But most importantly, carry these lessons with you into the future and build that stable foundation so that you're ready for the next big crisis. Good luck out there. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them for me in the comments and I'll answer any questions I can. Oh, and if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. We're uploading at least a video a week, so make sure you subscribe to stay up to date and notified. Their trust forever. Confront it. Hopefully, any hesitancy is solely on your competitor's end and you might catch them sleeping, which is only to your advantage. The one who can move the fastest in this ever-changing environment is the one who can take the lead and come away the victor.